Hi, I'm Gareth, and in this video we're going to be considering a piece of advice that's often given in harmony textbooks. And the advice is, whatever you do when you're going from one chord to the next, try to avoid using chord 2 followed by chord 1. Is this good advice? Or is it possible to use that progression? Or if it's not possible to use it, well, why is that? And what would be a better progression? That's what we're going to be thinking about in this video. So first of all, let's just be entirely sure what we mean by chords 1 and 2. So I'm going to work in the key of C major because it's obviously got no sharps, no flats. So if we write out a scale of C major, it's going to look like this. And then in order to form the triads that are going to turn into chords, I'm putting a third and a fifth above each note of the scale. And if you're notating this, you always know you're right if you've got 3 consecutive lines or 3 consecutive spaces. So this will be 1. We always do chord labeling in Roman numerals. And so this is simply how it works. And these triads that I'm producing are what we turn into chords that may have 4 or more notes in them if you want them to. The last one's not 8, it's 1, because effectively this chord is the same as this chord, it's just in a different octave. So that's how we arrive at this. So when we're saying, should you avoid using a 2 to 1 chord progression, just so we're crystal clear, we're saying that this advice says, don't use this chord followed by that chord. So there's nothing wrong with chord 2, there's nothing wrong with chord 1, but the advice is you want to try and avoid going chord 2 followed by chord 1. Now, it's possible that you might be thinking, oh, I don't know what all this Roman numeral stuff is, though hopefully you can see the principle, but you might think, oh, well, actually that's a chord of C, and that's a chord of D minor, and that's a chord of E minor, that's a chord of F, that's a chord of G, that's a chord of A minor. This is a B diminished chord, and then we're back to a C chord again at the top. So I've kind of labeled things using both these systems, so you know what we're talking about depending on what your particular musical background is. Okay, so if I want to use this chord 2, but say I want to use it in 4 parts, the notes are D, F, A, and all I need to do is to double one of those notes. So you can see I've got a D here, I've got an F there, I've got an A there, but I've used the D again. So all you've got to do is double up on one of the notes to get to 4 parts, or maybe double up on 2 of the notes if you want to have 5 parts. So you're just using these basic triads to generate your chords. Okay, now then, let's have a look at what I've written here, because this is using those notes of the triad for chord 2, and I've turned that into a 4-part chord, and I'm following that with chord 1. So this is this one, the C, E, G chord, or the C major chord. And again, I've turned it into 4 parts, C, E, G, and the C is doubled there. Don't have to double the bottom note of the chord, but that's often what happens. So what is the problem here? Let's just play it. Here's chord 2 followed by chord 1. Well, you might listen to that and think, well, it sounds all right to me. What's the problem with that? As always, with this kind of advice, everything is about context. So if you're listening to something and you're thinking, well, I've broken a rule, but actually it sounds good in the piece that I'm writing or the piece that I'm playing, fine, go for it. There's no reason to have to avoid it. But let me just unpack why this advice exists. Well, when we go from chord 2 to chord 1, we quite often end up with a problem with consecutives. Okay, let's just think about this for a moment. So the bass line here, for example, is going D, C, and the soprano line is also going D, C in a different octave. So can you see what's actually happening here? We've got this D, C, D, C. That's what we call consecutive octaves. You might know them as parallel octaves. What that actually means is that I've got the same note in the top and the bottom parts, D, followed by the same note in the top and the bottom parts again. So they both go D followed by C. So they're effectively an octave apart, or in this case, 2 octaves apart. And so we get 2 parts going D, C. We've also got another little difficulty in that if we look at the bass part and this tenor part, we can see that we've got consecutive fifths. So what does that mean? Well, if I look at this, D to A is a fifth apart, and in particular, a perfect fifth. And if you're not sure about intervals, we've got material on that elsewhere, so you can find that. And then we've got another fifth, C to G. So if I go perfect fifth, that's consecutive fifths or parallel fifths. So do you see what happens? When we go from 2 to 1, we quite often end up with consecutive octaves and with consecutive fifths. And the kind of rules of chord progressions are that, generally speaking, we should avoid consecutive fifths and consecutive octaves. It just means that everything's moving in the same direction by the same interval, and it doesn't help to maintain the independence of the 4 voices. And we get that sort of slightly jarring impact of that. Now, if you're writing power chords or something, well, you're going to be writing consecutive fifths all over the place, and it's part of the style. Nothing wrong with that. But if I'm in the context of a piece that's going along, avoiding all these consecutives, and then suddenly I do this, it kind of is weaker than the other progressions in that passage that I've just improvised, because now we suddenly hear those consecutives moving. So if we can have some independence, so we've not got the same interval followed by the same interval, that's always a good piece of advice when you come to write in 4 parts in particular. So you might say, well, that's fine, we can sort of reorganize things a bit, couldn't we? You know, I mean, I could do something like this maybe. So I've got chord 2 followed by chord 1 again, exactly the same situation. And, you know, maybe if I just reorganize things, it will be all right. But you see, the trouble is now, all I've done is moved the problem elsewhere. Because now you can say, oh, great, I haven't got consecutive octaves between those outer parts like I did in the first example. But can you see the octaves are now moved here? So now we've got consecutive octaves between the tenor and the bass part, which is a pain, isn't it? I've got consecutive fifths between the alto and the bass part. I've also got consecutive fifths between the alto and the tenor part. So they're going all over the place, aren't they? So in other words, the chances of writing consecutive octaves, consecutive fifths are hugely enhanced if you have the progression 2 followed by 1. Now, is there a way around it? Well, you might be able to find that if you could somehow do something like that chord 2 to this chord 1, that might work a little bit better. Well, let's consider that for a moment and see what I've just done and think why it might work better. Oops, excuse the wobbly line. There we go. Magic straight liner, just what we need. If I do this, for example, so I'm still using 2 followed by 1, or D minor followed by C major. Immediately you can see that what's going on between these outer parts is they're going in opposite directions. So instead of going in the same direction, actually going in what we call contramotion is going to make life a lot better. So, and then, you know, if I can fill in something like that, well, those upper 2 parts are now a 6 apart, so that's okay. And if I did something like this in the tenor, we should be, just double checking, yeah, we're free of any consecutive fifths or any consecutive octaves. So if you wanted to have chord 2 followed by chord 1, doing the thing I've just written, is better. And you can hear it's better than everything going in the same direction like the first one or the second one. Now we've got this, which works better, doesn't it? Okay, so it's possible to use a 2 followed by a 1 without using those consecutive fifths or consecutive octaves, but you've got to be very careful about how you design it. And it's really about trying to get some contrimotion and some independence of part movement. So many textbooks will say, avoid using chord 2 followed by chord 1 because you'll always end up with consecutives or parallels. Well, I don't think that's entirely true, because this illustrates that it's possible to do it. Well, it depends on things, doesn't it? Like, have you got a given melody that you're working with, or are you free to write your own melody and, you know, all the rest of it? But that's the trick, really. If you're going to do it, try to get some contribution, especially between the top and the bottom parts. I do think there's another issue, though. If you go 2 to 1, it can sound all right. It's just that if you go 5 to 1, or a chord of G to a chord of C, it tends to sound much stronger. So can you see what I've done here? I'm using chord 5 to replace the chord 2. Now, how is that possible? When I was using the chord 2, I was harmonizing this D, wasn't I? Well, D is at the bottom of chord 2. It's in the middle of chord 7, and it's at the top of chord 5. So it means that if I've got a D, if that's a given, I could use chord 2 or chord 5 or chord 7. Well, I could use chord 7, but chord 7 is a diminished chord, as we can see from that. And you see it's a diminished chord. It's got a root, the B, and a minor third above that B, and a diminished fifth above that B with the F. So that's a diminished chord. Working with diminished chords can have its complications. Not impossible, but, you know, to be handled with care, shall we say. 5, however, is a really strong chord, because we say that chords 1, 4 and 5 are primary chords. Chord 2 is a secondary chord, so if we go 2 to 1, we've gone secondary to primary. Nothing particularly wrong with that. But if we go 5 to 1, we go primary to primary. And if we do that, particularly at the end of a phrase, it's much stronger to go 5 to 1 than it is to go 2 to 1. Because at the end of a phrase, you want a cadence preferably. So if you go 5 to 1, or you go 4 to 1, or you go something to 5, or if you go 5 to 6, you know, these are all kind of commonly used cadences. They're kind of musical punctuation. Whereas 2 to 1 is not a recognized cadence. So it's definitely worth avoiding the 2 to 1 progression at the end of a phrase. But if I use 5 to 1, I've got 2 nice strong chords. And it also means things like, if I'm going D, C in the melody in exactly the same way that I was doing back there, actually my bass line is not going to give me consecutives, because the soprano line is moving by step, the bass line is leaping. So it's not contribution, but because I've got one going by step and one leaping, it can't possibly give me any consecutives to worry about. And as long as I can avoid them in the other parts, well, we're in business. So, you know, we've got rid of our threat of consecutives or parallels, and we've written what will ultimately be a stronger progression. That's 5 to 1. Here's the 2 to 1 we started with. So the bottom line, you know, should you avoid using 2 to 1 chord progressions? The advice is often that you should. And what I'm suggesting here is there's no imperative to say we have to avoid those progressions, but if you're going to use them, be very careful that you don't end up with this kind of pile up of consecutive octaves and consecutive fifths. Try not to use it at the end of a phrase. If you are going to use it, try to do something like that, where you're particularly aiming for contribution between the top and the bottom parts. But always consider, if you're thinking of writing a progression like 2 to 1, well, would it be stronger to use 5 to 1? Or if you were using these as your top notes, F followed by E, well, F comes in chord 4. So chord 4 followed by chord 1, instead of using 2 to 1 like that, to go 4, 1, again, sounds a lot stronger, particularly if it's at a cadence point at the end of a phrase. So I always sort of think, well, never say never, because the bottom line is, what does it sound like? Particularly, what does it sound like in the context? And if you've written chord 2 followed by chord 1, and it is the most brilliant sounding thing in your composition, well, stick with it. If you've written consecutives because you're writing power chords or something, absolutely fine, it fits with the style. If you're writing in more conventional tonal harmony and you're thinking, yeah, I've got a 2 to 1 there, it doesn't sound quite right, check and see if you've got consecutives, see if you can fix them, and then consider, actually, would it be better to replace that first chord, that chord 2, with something else? And if you can replace it with a 5, maybe because you're using D as the first note, or with a 4, maybe because you're using F as the first note, it will often give you a better outcome. So I hope that's helpful in explaining why textbooks often advise us to avoid this particular progression, what the pitfalls are, and just to encourage you to think about what the alternatives might be, so you can weigh up using 2 to 1 against one of the alternatives, then think what's really going to work better in the context in which I'm working. Well, I hope you found this video helpful, and if you have, let me invite you to take a little trip to the Music Matters website, www.mmcourses.co.uk. And if you know a little bit of music theory already, but you're thinking, I really want to understand this stuff about chords much better, get more adventurous in my use of chords and harmony and so on, have a look at our Advanced Theory course, which is really kind of covering all this territory and much more. If you're thinking, well, yeah, I'd like to know about that, but my basic theory isn't quite as sorted as it could be, well, have a look at our 1 to 8 theory course, and 1 to 5 is covering all the nuts and bolts of music theory, all the stuff that you have to know to be really confident about what you're doing with every aspect of music, and then you'll be able to push on and do all this chord stuff from there. Lots of other stuff on the website, but that might be a particular course that's of interest to some people viewing this video. www.mmcourses.co.uk